Hello everyone, and welcome back to this channel. I'm so excited for you to be here. We have quite a few books to get through, so I'm just going to jump right into it, into this little April wrap-up, and talk about the books that I read. First on my little stack over here is World War Z. This is in no particular order, so I'm just picking them up off of the stack as they lay there. This was just more of an experiment. I got this as a Book of the Month add-on. I was just kind of curious to see what this would be like, because I don't really like zombie movies, but I couldn't really imagine the way you would have like a zombie novel, because we have so many zombie things. So we have series that talk about zombies, we have, movies that talk about zombie invasions and all of that. And so I was like, what would a book about a zombie apocalypse look like? So I ordered this and read it. I thought it was kind of good. The idea behind this book is basically that it's told like in the past tense. So we're in the future, and a person that has talked to tons of different people that basically went through a zombie apocalypse or a zombie world war. And he interviews all of them originally for a report for the UN. The author in the story gets frustrated that the UN report kind of just included like all of the numbers and facts instead of going into the stories of the people. And he basically decides to recount all of those stories, and that's why this is subtitled An Oral History of the Zombie War, because this is basically like a transcript of all of his interviews. Because of that, that does two things with this novel. So for one, we have totally different perspectives on this world war and how this zombie thing erupts. So we have voices all over the world, which I thought was kind of cool because we did get different cultural views, but at the same time that also means that we're not really staying with a character, because it's truly just the interviews. So even the author of this book doesn't really talk much about, doesn't talk about himself or what happened to him, and so we're just jumping from person to person. And because of that, we don't really have any character binding. I'm a character person. I like getting deep and diving into characters, so that didn't have this, and that's why this is like a good 3-star for me. It was very entertaining. But what I did like was to kind of see the parallels to the pandemic, because I do feel like the pandemic did, every single country responded kind of differently initially to the pandemic. Eventually we all had to get on the same boat and do the exact same things, but seeing the differences in initial response being due to cultural differences is kind of reflected in this novel, and that's what I liked about it. Moving on, we have The Attic Child, which is just the next book on my pile over here. This was a Book of the Month book. The idea is that we have a boy and a girl that are both shunned into an attic of this house, but they are basically shunned into the attic like 50 years apart. So we have two different perspectives on the story, one in the early 20th and in the late 20th century. So I think the beginning of the one story is around 1910, and then the other story is in the 90s. We hear the recounting of this boy who's basically kidnapped from the Congo and brought to England, and how his life unfolds there as a child that is obviously treated completely differently in a very colonialist England. And then we have this perspective from the 90s of the girl that was also locked into this attic and found some of the things from the boy several years before. And she then goes on this journey of trying to find out who this boy was. And so we kind of see both of these stories unfolding, and eventually we have that moment where they intertwine, where the stories intertwine, and we find out what happens to both of these people. And I thought that was kind of a cool way to go about the story, because we had both of those perspectives. So we have this harsh part on colonialism, where we see how this poor boy is just treated terribly in colonialist England because of his skin and all of the things that he endures and has to go through. But what I really enjoy about the story is that we kind of end in a way where we're not talking about Black suffering, but we're talking also about Black joy. And I feel like that's something that's really not mentioned in a lot of stories, or that we just don't focus on. A lot of the stories that we're focusing on, especially in anti-racism, is all about suffering. And I feel like that's just not, that's just obviously not the whole story of a person, right? A person may have traumas in their past, and Black people usually do, because of all kinds of shit that went down, but Black joy is still something that we should appreciate and still should be reading about, and making sure that that is also part of these people's stories. And that's kind of where this was wholesome to me at some point. I did feel like this book was a bit long. Didn't need to be this long in my opinion, but I still gave it a good 3.5 stars because I really did enjoy it, and I think there are some very important motives in the story that are well worth the read. The next book on this nice little pile over here is Ready Player One. I was super curious about this book because I remembered Noelle Gallagher recommending this book in one of her videos, and it just sounded like such an out there story. And I had also seen the movie previously and did not enjoy the movie, so I was like, you know what, I'm just kind of curious about this. And since I also got it as a fairly cheap book of the month add-on, I thought, you know what, let me get this. I'm just gonna let you know I partially listened and partially read this book, and it's also a very fun audiobook. So if you do have this on hand or you can get it from your library as an audiobook, big recommend. But basically this story is about a future civilization that's not too far off, where basically most of the people are living in this virtual world called the Oasis. The person that invented the Oasis at the beginning of the story were explained that he has passed away a few years back, and he then somewhere in the Oasis has left like an Easter egg, he calls it, and if you find this Easter egg, you inherit his entire imperium. Of course, that is a lot of money, and so a lot of people like originally start trying to find this Easter egg, and eventually people give up because years have passed and no one's ever been able to find it, until we have this character and he finds like the first step or the first key and able to get to this Easter egg, because you have to clear 3 keys and 3 gates to get there. The protagonist in the story is the first one to find the first key. It's very action-packed. It's a lot of fun to read. There's a lot of like, I don't know, 80s nostalgia in the book. It's very much like a gamey book. I don't know, very, very fun. But probably not anything that's going to stick with me forever. So I also gave it 3 stars, but it was definitely a fun read. And if you feel like reading something that's super fast paced, a lot of very gamey and just something very different, then this is a book for you. My next book on this list is Kristen Hanna's The Great Alone. I originally fell in love with Kristen Hanna with her novel that I read first, which was The Nightingale. And I read that novel, I sobbed for days. And that novel still to this day is something that that book just is with me, like it lives within me. It is an absolute 5-star. So since then I've started reading some of her other books. I think The Four Winds was another book that I read, and then this one, The Great Alone, that I picked up from Book of the Month also as an add-on. Can you notice that I have some credits to burn through? And it did not disappoint. The Great Alone plays in Alaska, and I've never read a book like from that part of the world, so it was super interesting. It's about this family, and primarily the daughter in this family, and the family moves to Alaska, and they're basically trying to escape their shit. The father in this story obviously has PTSD from the war in Vietnam, and that does have a very bad effect on the family, and the mother in this dynamic is quite enabling, and the daughter's the only one that has some sense. Within the first 100 pages of this book, I did get really angry at the people, because I'm just like, oh my god, the toxicity. But I still kept reading it, of course. And in Alaska, we just have all these different characters that are just all in and of themselves. They're just pretty cool. I especially enjoyed Large Marge. Yeah, the name alone, but she was just such an amazing character. So it's a very typical kind of Kristen Hanna type happy end, which is never really a happy end, but somehow a happy end. This was a book that definitely talked a lot about like escaping from a toxic situation and safe havens and finding healing within yourself and how to actually do that and deal with all kinds of trauma that's basically been tossed at you. I feel like this book had Alaska as a character, and that's also something that I really enjoyed, because Alaska, the state and the weather and all of the way this was described in that book was just so fantastic. I felt like that was a character and a mood in this whole book. So if you feel like survivalism, escapism, this is your read. I don't remember the rating that I gave this. It's probably around 4 stars, because it made me sob like a little girl for several hours, but yeah, still a classic Kristen Hanna, and learned so many things. Always learn so many things. Okay, so I have one book over here that's like an instant 5-star, but it's the last physical copy I have here with us, so I'm going to quickly grab my phone and check what else I have on my list that I don't have here as a physical copy. Oh wait, there is one more physical copy. So we have one second to last physical copy, and that is The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. And this was a reread. And I originally read this when I was in 11th grade, so We're not going to talk about how many years ago that actually was. Let's not go there. This was a reread, and basically my dad gave this to me for Christmas. He didn't know that I originally read this book quite a few years ago, but he found it, and my dad, or that side of my family, is Native, so we like talking about what it kind of means being of Native descent if you have literally no connection to that community whatsoever because you're living in Europe and you're white passing. So when I was young, I got this book and I read it and I absolutely enjoyed it. This book is about Junior, and Junior is Native American. He lives on a reservation, and he decides basically that he wants to go to school outside of the reservation. He basically kind of realizes through not so wonderful things that he most likely won't be able to reach his full potential on the reservation in the school setting, so he has to go to a primarily white school in order to do so. This book is a very quick read because it's written more like a diary, truly. It also has a lot of like comic sketches because Junior likes to draw comics, and so we see his sketches throughout this book. And I love the way this is like a first-person book, but it still shows you exactly how all of the long transgenerational trauma and stuff that happened to these communities is seen today, right? We see a lot of alcoholism in this book, of course, because that unfortunately is something that you see a lot on reservations today. But he also talks about how and why this alcoholism came to be, but in really simple terms, because it's a diary of this kid. And he's trying to reconcile with the fact that he is Indian, he's Native, and he's very proud of it. However, he also knows that in order to succeed in that context, he has to leave the world that he's in because that world has been systemically put down, and he has to go into this predominantly white world where people don't know how to treat him or how to be friends with him or anything because he's so exotic in their eyes. I just love the way that that is portrayed. It's just, to me, it's fantastic because when I was reading this originally at, I don't know, like 17, that was the first time I really understood what systemic oppression is and like how that can come over several generations. Fantastic book, super interesting. This is a 5-star, an old 5-star. Yeah, I got this for Christmas, and this is like the 20th anniversary edition. That's a nice little hardback. I think previously I had the paperback, and so this is a nice book for my collection that I'm very excited about. Okay, so yes, that was definitely one of the 5 stars of this month. I do, however, have another 5-star over here, but I'm just going to quickly check my list because I listened to a memoir called When Breath Becomes Air. I semi-enjoyed this, so I only had this as an audiobook on Libby, and When Breath Becomes Air was not so much my cup of tea. And I hate to say that about a memoir because it's like, obviously this is the actual lived experiences of a person, and especially a person that is not with us anymore, and wrote this because they were very, very sick. So When Breath Becomes Air is written by a person who, he's a surgeon and he's a doctor, and he eventually realizes he has fairly horrible cancer. And so he talks in this book about how he kind of reconciles with not knowing what your purpose in life is, especially if you are this sick and you don't know how much longer you have on this earth. Why I didn't like this book is essentially because he is in this weird hustle culture frame. Hear me out. I come from academia, right? And I basically just quit academia because that shit is toxic and I don't need it in my life. A lot of the people that I used to work with in academia basically were always like, this is my calling. It can be this stressful, it can be this horrible, it can be this bad for my family because it is my calling. Instead of like criticizing the system and saying, hey, maybe we should create a system in which more people have access to this because it's not a toxic piece of shit to work in. Instead of criticizing that, they would, if people leave academia like me, criticize them and be like, well, they're making a lifestyle choice. You know, they're going the easy route. This author did that in like the first 30 pages. He was like, oh yeah, all of the people from med school, they were making lifestyle choices to go down, I don't know, becoming different kinds of doctors. But he was following his calling because he was going to surgery. So when I originally read that, I was like, oh, okay, so maybe this is like a book where he reflects that is toxic thinking. But he doesn't. He never gets to that point. To the end of this book, he basically holds on to this: surgery is so fantastic, surgery is so great, and all of us work so hard in it, so hard, because it is our calling. And instead of just saying that maybe surgery could change, or maybe the specialty could change and we should maybe not make people work like 24-hour shifts or even more at once, he was just like, no, it can be that way because it's my calling. He never really realized that, while at the same time he kind of did, because when he was talking about if he knew if he was going to live 10, 5, 2 years or 1 year or whatever, he was thinking about doing different things. Like if he knew he was going to be able to live for 10 years, he would go back to surgery, but if he would only live for 1 year, he would just stick with his family. And I was just kind of like, doesn't that tell you something? Doesn't that already tell you something about what you maybe should spend your life doing? People can have differences in life philosophy, and obviously that probably triggered me because I just came out of a situation like that, and I just made the decision against that, even though it was my dream to do a PhD. I do not have time in my life for toxic shit. Another book that I have over here that I had the physical copy of, but I lent it to a friend, is A Long Petal of the Sea. So this book starts right before the Spanish Civil War, and they introduce a family that in essence has to flee because of the oppressive government of Franco. And they flee from Spain to Chile, and later on they have to flee from Chile, and then they come back to Chile. And I just thought this book was very interesting. It was one of those transgenerational books that I really enjoy, and also it had really interesting historical aspects. Like I've mentioned in previous videos, we did learn a lot about World War II, obviously here growing up in Germany. However, we did not learn as much about neighboring countries and what was going on then. And actually I learned after school that there was a civil war in Spain, and they also had fascism there and everything. That was kind of something that I didn't really know much about. That's why I really enjoyed this book, and it was very fascinating. It was very fact-based, but that's also why it didn't suck me in as a story. So this book is still written with a certain distance to the actual characters. So I felt like I didn't really fully get to know any of the characters. The historical context was interesting enough, and that was something that I picked up this book for and also finished it for. Right. And now, last but certainly not least, the book that this month, okay, I can't even speak. We have this one. You've probably heard a lot about this book, Babel, Babel. To me, this is pronounced Babel because in German, if you write BB, so B-A-B-B-E-L with a double B, that would be Babel. Then you say it quickly. But if you have it like this, it would be a long A. So in my head, this is Babel. I'm not exactly sure if it's pronounced that way. Anyway, so I started reading this. This is quite a long book, and I had heard last year that this was totally hype. I had my reservations about it, and also it's a low fantasy magical realism book, so it does have magical elements in them, and that is something that not my thing. So I can't really dabble in fantasy that much. There are some low fantasy books that I can read, but there's like a threshold that I cannot go beyond. So I started reading it, but it was quite, in the beginning it really sets a scene, and so I kind of switched to the audiobook after reading maybe like 50 pages because I was like, I am intrigued, but I know that with audio I'm going to be more interested and just more immersed into the story. In hindsight, that was actually, I think, a really good decision because this book has a lot of footnotes, and in the audiobook that is a different narrator that actually reads the footnotes, and I feel like that gives more to the story. Like I really enjoyed that fact. So this book is about Robin, and Robin was born in Cantonese China, and he is then basically kind of ripped out of his original surroundings by this British dude and brought to England. This is all set in a world where we have silver. This silver can have magical properties if it is used in the context of translation, meaning that maybe we have this piece of silver and on one side we have something in German and on the other side we have something in English, and it can use magic in the lost translation between those two words, which is a very interesting concept, and I think that's why I even started reading this book, because that is such an interesting idea. If we kind of think about it, it kind of makes sense because every translation, you can't really literally translate some words. So maybe this is also because my brain is bilingual. Sometimes I truly cannot find a translation from one word or one language into the other. And so this is something that I've grappled and dealt with all of my life. So using that lost translation in the middle as magic, such a fantastic concept. So I was like, okay, Intrigued. Robin is then educated in England and then brought to Oxford, and he is in this very small group of people who are supposed to work at Babel, which is the Translation Institute of Oxford that basically then makes all of the silver work. Since they're kind of like losing languages because like Latin and Greek are just so basic that they can't really use it anymore for magic or for silver, they're starting to bring in more exotic languages, meaning they're bringing in kids from all around the world that look very different from British people, and they're basically making them part of this institute to translate. So when I originally started with this book, I was kind of like, okay, you know, this has dark academia vibes, like I'm vibing with this, but I didn't think it was super interesting in the first half of the book, but it kind of sucked me in more and more because we had this wonderful description of colonialism. So we had this wonderful, I don't know, thing with colonialism because essentially these kids are coming to Babel and they're translating and they're working for the British Empire that is then using the silver also to suppress their own communities, right? So what an interesting concept in and of itself. And then also this casual racism, this casual things of like how, I don't know, these kids code switch, for example. And it's just like, I'm not going to say much about the second half except my jaw dropped. And I heard like almost the complete second half on a train ride. And I just sat there, or at least the part where it picks up. And I was just sitting there for 4 hours on the train just being like, because I was listening to it. And I thought it was a fantastic second half. This book is also called, as a subtitle, and it didn't say this on the front, so I didn't realize this until later. This is called Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, an Arcane History of the Oxford Translators' Revolution. The necessity of violence, like in uprising or in colonialism, as a resistance is kind of brought up as a concept in this book, and that's why, hear me out, that's why I don't mind the telling. Like I said, a lot of people criticize this book for saying, you know, it's explaining the emotions like too much. We want to have like subtle interpretations, right? We want to see these things in the novel and we want to like grasp them like deep down and interpret these into the text. But I feel like the author deliberately tells us what these interpretations are, deliberately, because it's also part of violence, right? Telling us these things instead of like letting us subtly accept what it's trying to say, and instead, you know, telling us this is the exact motion or these are the exact things that is going through this person's head at that moment, is also part of like an offensive move on her side. And that's why, to me, that is perfectly in line with this book. Like, I understand why some people would criticize that because it can be annoying in some parts. I get that, but to me, perfect. Originally, when I finished this, I was like, oh, I'm not sure if this is going to stay with me much, right? So I was like, okay, that second half, go you. And then I kind of forgot about it for a week. And then I started thinking about this book every single day since. So I originally rated it 4 or 4.5 stars, and I had to up it to 5 because I am obsessed with this book and I'm going to read it again. So I listened to most of it the last time, and I think I need to actually read this book because I want to annotate the shit out of this baby. I'm so excited to do that. All right, was that a note to finish this on? I have a meeting in 15 minutes, so I have to wrap up this video. And those are all the books that I read in April. I think one of them I finished in March. However, I filmed my March wrap up a few days before March ended, so one of these books is also from March, but I don't think that that's super interesting to you guys. So thank you very much for being here today, for spending time with me. Let me know in the comments what you read last month. Let me know if you've read Babel yet. Honestly, super interested. Should we do a live stream on that? Should we talk about this book some more? Like, should I make a reading vlog of this when I'm actually rereading it again? I don't know. Let's get into the discussion. I'm just so obsessed with this book. I think we need to talk about it a little more. So let me know in the comments in what shape or form you would like that. And thank you for being here today, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.